The wind screamed across the ice fields like a wounded animal. Colin Reed pulled his thermal coat tighter as frozen crystals pelted his face mask. He had studied winter storms on 6 different planets, but Frostholm's blizzards were something else entirely. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in the last hour, and visibility was down to almost nothing. He should have returned to base camp 3 hours ago. His research equipment was safely stored, his samples were logged, but something had kept him out here. Call it instinct, call it stupidity. Either way, Colin couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm swallowed all sound except the howling wind. Colin checked his scanner again, looking for any heat signatures that might indicate the glacier caves he'd been mapping. Instead, the device picked up something else. 2 small heat sources, faint and getting weaker, about 200 meters to his east. Animal life on Frostholm was rare and usually deep underground during storms like this. These signatures were on the surface, exposed to the full fury of the blizzard. Colin hesitated only a moment before changing direction. His survival training told him to head back. His conscience wouldn't let him. The snow was waist-deep in places. Every step forward felt like pushing through concrete. His legs burned with effort, and his breathing came hard inside the mask. The heat signatures were moving slightly, which meant whatever they were still alive. Barely. Colin almost walked right past them. 2 small shapes huddled against a rock formation, covered in snow and ice. At first, he thought they might be some kind of local fauna he hadn't cataloged yet. Then one of them moved, and he saw the scales. They were children. Alien children, but children nonetheless. Their bodies were covered in scales that shimmered between deep blue and silver, and small horns protruded from their heads. Wings, delicate and translucent, were folded tight against their backs. They looked almost like the dragons from old Earth legends, except they were small, terrified, and dying from the cold. The larger one saw Colin and tried to shield the smaller child behind them. A hiss escaped from between tiny, sharp teeth. The sound was weak, defensive, and heartbreaking. "Hey, it's okay," Colin said, though he knew they probably couldn't understand him. He held up his gloved hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The larger child's eyes were a bright amber color, alert but fading. The smaller one wasn't moving much at all. Colin could see ice forming on their scales. They wouldn't last another hour out here. He slowly removed his emergency thermal blanket from his pack. The larger child flinched but didn't run. Too weak, Colin realized. Moving quickly now, he wrapped the blanket around both children and lifted them. They were surprisingly light, their small bodies trembling violently. The larger one tried to struggle, making small chirping sounds of distress. The smaller one barely reacted at all. Colin held them close to his chest, using his own body heat to help warm them. "I've got you," he whispered. "Just hold on." Getting back to his shelter was the longest walk of Colin's life. The wind fought him every step. His arms ached from carrying the children. His own core temperature was dropping dangerously low. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, following his scanner's beacon back to the small research shelter he'd set up that morning. The door nearly froze shut, but Colin managed to force it open. He stumbled inside, immediately going to the heater and cranking it to maximum. The shelter was small, barely large enough for his equipment and sleeping bag, but it was warm and safe. Colin laid the children on a sleeping bag and unwrapped the thermal blanket. Their scales were covered in frost, and their breathing was shallow. He'd treated hypothermia before, but never in an alien species. He could only hope their biology worked similarly to what he knew. He grabbed his medical kit and the emergency heat packs, activating them and placing them carefully around the children. The larger one watched him with those amber eyes, still protective of the smaller child even in this state. The smaller one's eyes were closed, scales barely moving with each breath. "Stay with me," Colin said softly. He gently rubbed the children's limbs, trying to encourage circulation. Their scales felt like cool glass under his fingers. "Come on, kids. Don't give up." He boiled water on his small camp stove and added electrolyte powder. When it cooled enough, he offered it to the larger child. Those amber eyes studied him for a long moment before small clawed hands reached for the cup. The child drank slowly, then tried to give the rest to the smaller one. Colin helped them, carefully tilting the cup to the smaller child's lips. After a few sips, those eyes fluttered open. They were the same amber as the larger child's, but lighter, more gold than orange. As warmth slowly returned to the shelter, the children's shaking began to ease. Their scales started to lose the frost layer, revealing intricate patterns that caught the light. The larger one made a soft chirping sound, almost like a question. "I don't know what you're asking," Colin admitted, "but you're safe now. I promise." The storm raged outside. Inside the tiny shelter, a human researcher sat with two alien children he'd pulled from the jaws of death. He had no idea who they were or how they'd ended up in a blizzard on one of the harshest planets in the sector. But right now, that didn't matter. All that mattered was keeping them alive until the storm passed. The larger child's eyes finally closed, and within minutes, both children were sleeping. Colin stayed awake, monitoring their breathing, adjusting the heat packs, and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. 3 days had passed since Colin found the children in the storm. The blizzard still raged outside, showing no signs of stopping. Inside the shelter, things had changed dramatically. The children were recovering, their scales now vibrant and shimmering in the artificial light. They were also very awake and very curious. The larger child, a girl Colin had decided, was bold and protective. She positioned herself between Colin and her smaller brother whenever he moved too quickly. She watched everything Colin did with intense focus, those amber eyes tracking his every movement. Her brother was quieter, more observant. He would tilt his head when Colin spoke, as if trying to understand the sounds. Communication was a puzzle Colin tackled like any research problem. He started simple, pointing to himself. "Colin," then pointing again. "Colin." The girl watched carefully. Then she pointed at herself and made a musical chirping sound, 2 notes that rose and fell. She repeated it several times until Colin tried to copy it. His attempt was clumsy, but her eyes brightened. She pointed at her brother, who made a different sound, slightly deeper and with 3 notes instead of 2. Colin couldn't reproduce their names with human vocal cords, so he worked with what he had. He pointed at the girl, "Ka," then at the boy, "Soren." Simple names he could actually say. Kira tilted her head, considering. Then she pointed at him and attempted his name. "Colleen." Close enough. She seemed pleased with herself. From there, things progressed faster than Colin expected. The children were incredibly intelligent. Within a day, they'd picked up basic words. Food, water, warm, cold, sleep. They taught him some of their words too, though Colin struggled with a melodic language that seemed to rely as much on tone as on sound. Colin shared his rations carefully, unsure what the children could safely eat. They seemed to tolerate most of his supplies well enough, though they clearly preferred the protein bars to anything else. Soren especially lit up whenever Colin opened a new package, his wings fluttering slightly with excitement. The wings fascinated Colin. They were delicate, almost translucent, with patterns that reminded him of stained glass. When the children were calm and warm, the wings would occasionally spread slightly, catching the light and creating small rainbows across the shelter walls. That on the 4th day, Colin decided to risk asking about their situation. He pointed outside, then at them, then made a questioning gesture. "Family? Where?" Kira's expression changed immediately. Her scales seemed to darken slightly, and she pulled Soren closer. She made several sounds in her language, clearly distressed. Soren pressed against her side, his own scales shifting to a darker hue. Colin backed off immediately. Okay. It's all right. You don't have to tell me." He held up his hands in what he hoped was a calming gesture, but Kira seemed to want him to understand. She pointed at the ceiling, then made a sweeping gesture. Up, sky, space. Then she made sounds like explosions, her small hands showing something falling, crashing. Her eyes were wide, remembering something terrible. Colin's stomach dropped. A crash. They'd been in some kind of ship that crashed. That explained how 2 children ended up alone on Frostholm, but raised more questions. Where were the adults? Where was the crash site? How long had they been wandering in the cold before he found them? He tried to ask, but Kira, just shook her head. She didn't know, or she couldn't explain in the limited vocabulary they shared. Instead, she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched Colin's hand with her small clawed fingers. The gesture was clear. "Thank you." Colin felt something tighten in his chest. These weren't just alien children. They were just children, period. Scared, lost, and trying to be brave. He gently squeezed her hand back. "I'll help you find your family. I promise." The days settled into a routine. Colin taught them more words. They taught him some of theirs. He showed them pictures from his research files, and they pointed excitedly at images of other planets, other species. Soren was particularly fascinated by Earth animals, making delighted chirping sounds at pictures of birds and lizards. Kira remained watchful and protective, but she started to relax around Colin. She would sit next to him while he worked on his reports, sometimes touching the scales on her arms where he'd treated frostbite damage. The scales were growing back normally, which relieved Colin immensely. Night. The children would curl up together in Colin's sleeping bag, their small forms barely making a lump under the thermal layers. Colin made do with his emergency blanket and extra clothing. He didn't mind. Watching them sleep peacefully was worth a little discomfort. On the sixth day, something changed. Colin was checking the weather monitors when Soren made an excited chirping sound. He was pointing at the scanner display, where several large signatures had appeared in orbit above Frostholm. Ships. Big ones from the look of the readings. Colin felt a surge of hope. Maybe a rescue party? Someone looking for the children? But Kira's reaction was strange. She stared at the display, her scales rippling through several colors. She looked scared, but also excited. She grabbed Soren and hugged him tight, speaking rapidly in their musical language. Colin watched them, confused. "Do you know those ships?" Kira looked at him, her amber eyes showing emotions Colin couldn't quite read. She touched her chest, then pointed at the display. Then she made a gesture that took Colin a moment to understand. Big, important, powerful. Something about her expression made Colin uneasy. These weren't just any ships. They meant something specific to these children. The way Kira looked both relieved and worried suggested this wasn't a simple rescue party. The storm was finally breaking. The ships were descending through the atmosphere, and Colin was beginning to realize that finding two lost children in a blizzard might have been the easy part. Whatever came next was going to change everything. Across the galaxy, in a massive fortress hidden within an asteroid field, Dravener the Eternal was making people disappear. Not metaphorically, actually making them vanish from existence. The crime lord's rage had become legendary in the 6 days since his children went missing. 3 rival syndicate leaders had already been eliminated. Dozens of information brokers had been questioned so violently that survivors stopped taking contracts entirely. Every smuggler, thief, and criminal in 4 sectors was hunting for any scrap of information about 2 small Dragon Clan children. Dravener stood nearly 3 meters tall, his scales a deep crimson that darkened to black along his spine. His wings could span the width of a small ship when fully extended. Centuries of ruling the galactic underworld had made him both feared and respected. But right now, he was just a father who couldn't find his children. "Nothing," Vira reported, entering the command chamber. His second-in-command was half his size but twice as deadly, her silver scales marked with battle scars. The smuggler knew nothing useful. The trail goes cold at the outer rim. Dravener's claws scraped against the metal table, leaving deep gouges. "Someone took them. Someone dared to touch my children." His voice was a rumble that made the walls vibrate. "I want every ship that left the station that day tracked. Every single one. We're working on it." Vira pulled up a holographic display showing hundreds of flight paths. "The problem is timing. The kidnapper had a 3-hour head start before we realized Kira and Soren were gone. That's enough time to jump to dozens of systems." Dravener stared at the web of possible routes. His children had been visiting one of his legitimate business stations, disguised as the offspring of a wealthy merchant. Security had been tight. Not tight enough, apparently. Someone had bypassed his best people and stolen the 2 beings he valued most in the entire universe. "The Syndicate of Red Stars denies involvement," Vira continued. So do the Carthan Empire remnants and the Free Merchant Coalition. They would deny it whether they were involved or not. Dravener's eyes glowed with barely contained fury. What about the Orion group? Vira hesitated. Their leader requested a meeting. He swears on his clan's honor they had nothing to do with it. He even offered his own resources to help search. That gave Draven a pause. Clan honor among the Orion group meant something. They were criminals, yes, but they followed certain rules. Taking children violated those rules in the worst possible way. And the others? Everyone's terrified. Your reputation was already formidable. Now, Vira shook her head. Half the underworld thinks you'll burn entire planets to find Kira and Soren. They're not wrong. Dravener would do exactly that if necessary. His children were everything. Kira, brave and fierce even at her young age. Soren, thoughtful and clever, always watching and learning. The thought of them scared, hurt, or worse, made his blood burn with rage that threatened to consume him entirely. There, Virus said suddenly, highlighting a flight path on the display. Small transport, registered to a shell company. Left the station 90 minutes after the children disappeared. Jumped to the frontier sector. Follow it. We have. The ship crashed on Frostholm. Ice planet barely colonized. The wreckage was found 2 days ago. Dravener's heart, if he still had one after centuries of violence, clenched. Bodies, the pilot, no one else. No sign of Kira or Soren. Vira zoomed in on the frozen planet. But Frostholm had a massive blizzard hit right around the time of the crash. If they survived the impact and got away from the wreckage, she didn't need to finish. Dravener understood perfectly. His children, small and young, alone on a frozen death world during a storm that could kill even experienced explorers. The timeline was wrong. Too much time had passed. Even his species, adapted for harsh conditions, couldn't survive a week in those temperatures without shelter, unless they found help. Are there settlements? Dravener demanded. Research stations. Mining outposts. Nothing major. We're scanning now, but the storm interference makes it difficult. Dravener moved to the communications array himself. I want every ship we have at Frostholm within the hour. Scan every meter of that planet. Ground teams to every settlement. I don't care if it starts a diplomatic incident with the colonial authority. Find my children. Vira bowed and began issuing orders. Within minutes, the largest criminal fleet in the sector was moving toward Frostholm. News spread through the underworld like fire. Dravener the Eternal was coming, and nothing would stop him. As the fortress emptied, Dravener stood alone in the command chamber, staring at the image of Frostholm. His children were down there. He could feel it. 6 days of searching, threatening, and destroying had led here, to a frozen ball of ice at the edge of civilized space. Hold on, little ones, he whispered in the ancient Dragon Clan language. Father is coming. He remembered Kira's last words to him before the trip. She'd been excited to see the merchant station to pretend to be normal children for a few days. She'd made him promise to let them explore, to not hover too much. He'd agreed, wanting them to have some freedom despite the dangers of his life. That decision haunted him now. If he'd been more careful, more protective, this never would have happened. The kidnapper had been found dead in the crash, which meant Dravener couldn't even have the satisfaction of making him suffer. But someone had hired that kidnapper. Someone had planned this. When his children were safe, Dravener would find that person. And they would learn why even the most hardened criminals feared the name Dravener, the Eternal. Not because of his power or his resources, but because of what he did to those who threatened his family. The fleet jumped to hyperspace. Frostholm was 3 hours away. Dravener counted every second. Colin had never seen so many ships in one place. The sky above the near settlement, a small mining outpost called Frosthaven, was black with vessels of every size and configuration. The largest ones were warships that made the settlement's defensive platforms look like toys that he'd brought Kira and Soren here, hoping to find someone who could translate, maybe contact their family through official channels. Instead, he'd walked into what looked like an invasion. The settlement administrator, a nervous woman named Ruth, had taken one look at the children and gone pale. Oh no. Oh no. 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 She'd immediately started evacuation procedures, her hands shaking as she worked the communications panel. What's wrong? Colin asked, holding both children close. They seemed excited rather than scared, which confused him even more. Those are Dragon Clan marks, Ruth said, pointing at the patterns on Kira's scales. Royal Dragon Clan marks. Do you have any idea who these children belong to? Colin shook his head. I found them in the blizzard. They were dying. I just wanted to help them get home. Ruth laughed, but there was no humor in it. You helped them all right. You probably saved the lives of everyone in 4 sectors. Before Colin could ask what she meant, the largest ship began its descent. It was massive, painted in deep reds and blacks, with weapons arrays that could level a city. The ground shook as it landed just outside the settlement's perimeter. Kira and Soren were making excited chirping sounds, practically vibrating with energy. Kira grabbed Colin's hand and tugged, trying to pull him toward the landing ship. Soren was doing the same on his other side. I don't think that's a good idea, Colin said weakly. His researcher's curiosity was warring with his survival instincts, and survival was winning. The ship's cargo ramp lowered. Armed figures emerged first, dozens of them, wearing armor that looked both expensive and deadly. They formed a perimeter with military precision. Then came others, moving with predatory grace, scanning the area with weapons ready. Finally, someone else emerged. Someone massive. Colin had studied various alien species as part of his xenobiology training. He recognized Dragon Clan physiology from the textbooks. But pictures didn't do justice to the reality. The being that descended the ramp was terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. Dravener the Eternal looked like something from ancient myths. His scales gleamed crimson and black, each one the size of Colin's hand. His wings were partially extended, spanning at least 5 meters. His eyes glowed like molten gold as they scanned the settlement. When he moved, it was with the controlled power of something that could tear apart ships with its bare claws. Kira broke free from Colin's grip and ran. Soren was right behind her. They crossed the open ground between the settlement and the ship in seconds, their small wings fluttering with effort. Wait! Colin shouted, fear flooding through him. Those armed guards, that massive creature, they could hurt the children without even trying. But what happened next froze Colin in place. Dravener saw the children coming and dropped to his knees. The motion was so fast, it cracked the frozen ground. His massive arms opened wide, and Kira and Soren launched themselves into his embrace. The crime lord's carefully controlled expression shattered. He wrapped his wings around the children, holding them close, making sounds Colin had never heard before. Deep, rumbling notes mixed with higher musical tones. The children responded in kind, their small voices mixing with his in a harmony that was clearly words, clearly emotional, and clearly a reunion. Dravener was crying. Actual tears ran down his scaled face as he held his children, checking them over with gentle claws despite their massive size. He spoke to them in the Dragon Clan language, his voice shaking with emotion. Colin stood frozen, watching this impossibly dangerous being transform into a worried father. Ruth had backed away, along with most of the settlement's remaining population. The armed guards stood at attention, but several were watching the reunion with what looked like relief. Then Kira pointed at Colin. She was talking rapidly, gesturing between Colin and themselves. Soren joined in, his voice excited and grateful. They were telling their father something, and Colin had a sinking feeling he knew what a Dravener's glowing eyes fixed on Colin. The crime lord stood slowly, carefully setting the children down, but keeping one massive hand on each of their shoulders. He said something to a silver-scaled figure who'd emerged from the ship. That figure, smaller but no less dangerous-looking, began walking toward Colin. You are the human. The silver-scaled one spoke perfect standard, her voice cold and assessing. You are the one who had these children? Colin's mouth was dry. I found them in a blizzard. They were freezing to death. I just helped them. The figure studied him for a long moment. Show me your shelter. Show me where you kept them. Now. It wasn't a request. Colin led them back to his research site, his mind racing. The children kept looking back at him, making encouraging chirping sounds. They seemed to think everything was fine. Colin wasn't so sure. His shelter looked even smaller with a group of armed guards surrounding it. The silver-scaled figure, who'd identified herself as Vira, examined everything. The sleeping bag where the children had slept, the medical supplies Colin had used, the empty ration packages, his research notes where he'd tried to document their recovery and communication progress. Dravener ducked into the shelter, somehow fitting his massive frame through the door. He looked at everything Vira pointed out. The heat packs, the makeshift beds, the careful notes about the children's health and behavior. Colin stood outside with Kira and Soren, surrounded by guards who could kill him with a thought. He watched through the shelter's door as the most feared crime lord in the galaxy examined the place where Colin had cared for his children. When Dravener emerged, his expression was unreadable. He looked at Colin for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He spoke in heavily accented but understandable standard. "You saved my children's lives." Colin had been questioned by officials before. Ethics committees reviewing his research. Colonial authorities checking his permits. Even once by local police when his weather equipment was mistaken for surveillance devices. None of those experiences compared to being interrogated by Dravener, the Eternal, that they'd moved to the warship, which was somehow more intimidating on the inside than the outside. The corridors were wide enough for beings Dravener's size, and everything was built with function over comfort. Armed guards stood at every intersection. The whole ship hummed with barely restrained power. Colin sat in what he assumed was a conference room, though it looked more like a throne chamber. Dravener sat across from him, still impossibly large even when seated. Vira stood to the side, translating when needed, though Dravener's standard was better than he'd initially let on. Kira and Soren refused to leave Colin's side. They positioned themselves between him and their father, which would have been touching if it wasn't also terrifying. Every time Dravener's voice rose even slightly, Kira would chirp defensively and put her small hand on Colin's arm. "Tell me again," Dravener said, his voice controlled but intense. "From the beginning, how you found them." Colin had already explained 3 times, but he did it again. The storm, the heat signatures on his scanner, finding them half frozen against the rocks, bringing them to his shelter, warming them, feeding them, teaching them basic words so they could communicate. "You did not know who they were?" Dravener asked. "I didn't even know what species they were at first," Colin admitted. "I just knew they were children and they needed help." Vira made a sound that might have been disbelief. "You risk your life in a deadly storm for unknown aliens?" Colin shrugged. "They were kids. I couldn't just leave them there." Dravener leaned forward, his golden eyes studying Colin like he was a puzzle that didn't make sense. "You asked for nothing? No payment? No favor? No protection?" "I wasn't planning to ask for anything. I was just going to help them find their family and go back to my research." Colin paused, "Though I'm guessing that's not going to happen now. You understand who I am?" Dravener's voice dropped lower. "What I am?" Colin had pieced it together from Ruth's reaction and the way everyone aboard this ship moved with military precision mixed with criminal efficiency. "You're someone important, someone dangerous. And these are your children. I control the largest criminal organization in 4 sectors," Dravener said bluntly. "I have destroyed rivals who looked at me wrong. I have ended dynasties over insults. People fear my name across 100 worlds." He gestured to Kira and Soren. "And you had my children for 6 days. Alone. Helpless." The implication was clear. Colin could have done anything. Could have ransomed them. Hurt them. Used them as leverage. The fact that he hadn't was apparently so unusual that Dravener couldn't process it. "They weren't helpless," Colin said quietly. "Kira's fierce. She protected her brother the whole time. And Soren's smart. Picked up human words faster than I learned their language." He looked at the children, who were watching the conversation with wide amber eyes. "I just made sure they didn't freeze to death." Dravener made a rumbling sound deep in his chest. Kira responded with chirping sounds, gesturing at Colin and then at her own scales where the frostbite had healed. Soren joined in, pointing at Colin's bag where the medical supplies were stored. The crime lord listened to his children with complete attention. Whatever they were telling him, it seemed to matter more than anything Colin could say. When they finished, Dravener was quiet for a long moment. "My children say you treated their wounds with care," he finally said. "That you gave them your food when supplies were short. That you slept with only a blanket so they could have the warm sleeping bag." His eyes narrowed. "That you sang them songs when they were scared at night." Colin felt his face heat. "I'm not a great singer. I was just trying to help them sleep." "You taught them to laugh," Dravener continued. "Kira says you made them laugh when showing pictures of earth animals. Soren says you taught him a game with stones. Tic-tac-toe. He beat me every time after the first day." Vira was watching Colin with an expression he couldn't read. Dravener stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding until he towered over everyone in the room. Colin's survival instincts screamed at him to run, but he stayed seated. Running wouldn't help anyway. Dravener moved around the table with surprising grace. He stopped directly in front of Colin, close enough that Colin had to crane his neck to see his face. One massive clawed hand reached out. Colin closed his eyes, wondering if this was it. If he'd somehow failed some test. If caring for the children had violated some rule he didn't understand. The hand gently touched the top of Colin's head. When Colin opened his eyes, Dravener was kneeling, bringing them almost to eye level. "In 600 years," Dravener said quietly, "I have never met someone who helped without expecting something in return. Everyone wants something. Power, wealth, protection, influence." He glanced at his children. "You wanted nothing. You asked for nothing. Even now, facing me, you ask only to return to your work." "I like my work," Colin said, because he didn't know what else to say. Dravener made that rumbling sound again, but this time it sounded almost like laughter. "Most humans would be negotiating, trying to gain advantage from this situation. I'm not most humans. I'm a researcher who studies ice formations and likes to be left alone." Colin met Dravener's eyes. "I helped your kids because it was the right thing to do. That's all." The crime lord stared at him for what felt like hours. Then he stood and said something in the Dragon Clan language. Vira's expression shifted to shock. Several guards made surprised sounds. Dravener looked at Colin. "I am making a decision that will confuse my enemies and concern my allies. But my children have chosen, and I trust their judgment more than any advisor." The word spread through the galactic underworld in less than a day. Dravener the Eternal had declared a human under his personal protection, not as a business arrangement, not as a transaction, as family. Colin Reed sat in his newly expanded research station on Frostholm, still trying to process how his life had changed. The small shelter where he'd saved 2 children was now surrounded by state-of-the-art facilities, climate-controlled labs, and enough equipment to study ice formations for 10 lifetimes. All gifts he hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse. "You have to understand," Vira had explained during the journey back to Frostholm. "What Dravener did is unprecedented. He offered you friendship. True friendship, the kind our people reserve for bloodkin. He's essentially adopted you into his clan." Colin had stared at her. "I just wanted to help his kids not die." "Exactly. That's why it matters." Vira had almost smiled. "You're probably the most protected human in the galaxy now. Harming you would be the same as harming Dravener's children. Every criminal organization knows this. You could walk into the worst parts of any station and no one would touch you." Colin had tested this exactly once, when he'd needed supplies from a sketchy trading post near the frontier. The dealer had scanned his identity chip, gone pale, and offered everything for free. Colin had insisted on paying anyway, which apparently only made his reputation stranger. Now he stood in his new lab, reviewing data on glacial movements, when the familiar sound of a transport ship landing outside interrupted his work. Colin smiled. He knew that engine's signature. Kira burst through the door first, her scales shimmering with excitement. She'd grown in the 2 months since the rescue, her wings stronger and her scales showing more complex patterns. Colin. She'd mastered his name now, along with impressive amounts of human language. Soren followed more calmly, but his amber eyes were bright with happiness. He carried a small pack that probably contained whatever new trinkets or books he discovered. The younger twin had developed a fascination with human culture that Dravener found both amusing and concerning. "Hello, troublemakers," Colin said, kneeling to hug them both. They crashed into him with enough force to knock him over, wings fluttering and tails swishing with joy. "We brought gifts," Kira announced, pulling away to dig through her own bag. "Father said we should bring proper gifts because it's been a whole month since visiting." "You were here 3 weeks ago," Colin pointed out. "Too long," Soren declared, handing Colin a beautifully bound book. "It's about Earth mythology. The story's about dragons. Father thought you would like it." Colin accepted the book with genuine pleasure. Dravener's gifts were always thoughtful, chosen with care rather than just expensive. The crime lord had surprised Colin repeatedly with his intelligence and consideration. If summoned by thought, Dravener himself ducked through the enlarged doorway. Colin had insisted they didn't need to modify the station for someone who visited maybe once a month. Dravener had done it anyway. Colin read. Dravener's standard had improved dramatically. He insisted on practicing whenever they spoke. "You are well, very well. Your people delivered the new core samples from the southern glaciers. The data is fascinating." Colin stood, brushing ice crystals from his coat. "How are things in the organization?" Dravener made a rumbling sound of amusement. He discovered Colin was one of the few beings who asked about his work like it was a normal job. "Complicated. The Orion group tried to negotiate new trade routes through our territory. They were polite about it, at least, because they're terrified of you, because they learn what happens when you're not polite to family." Dravener's eyes glowed slightly. There had been an incident a month ago. Someone had tried to pressure Colin into sharing research data for a mining company, not realizing who his connections were. That someone no longer had a mining company, or several other possessions. Colin had asked Dravener to please not destroy people's entire businesses over minor annoyances. Dravener had agreed to scale back to just destroying their reputations instead. It was compromise. "I brought food," Kira announced, pulling out containers from her bag. "Human food." Father hired a chef who learned Earth cooking. They ate together in the lab's common area, the children chattering about their studies and adventures. Dravener had enrolled them in proper education now, hiring the best tutors in multiple subjects. They were learning combat, languages, mathematics, and art. Kira showed Colin drawings she'd made of their rescue, detailed sketches that captured that terrible storm and the small shelter. "You should visit the fortress," Soren said suddenly. "Father keeps asking, but he's too proud to insist." Dravener's scales darkened slightly, which Colin had learned meant embarrassment. "You're busy with research. I've been meaning to take a break anyway," Colin said truthfully. The ice wasn't going anywhere. "Besides, I'm curious to see where you live." The fortress turned out to be part criminal headquarters, part family home. Dravener showed Colin the strategic operations centers with professional pride, then the gardens where he grew plants from his ancestral world with personal care. The contrast was striking. Ruthless crime lord and devoted father existing in the same being. "People don't understand," Dravener said quietly during dinner in his private quarters. "They see the power, the violence, the control. They don't see why. You're protecting something," Colin guessed. "Your family, your people, everything you've built." Dravener nodded slowly. "For 600 years, I survived by trusting no one, by assuming every kindness had a price." He watched his children, who were playing a human board game Colin had taught them. Then you appeared, asked for nothing, expected nothing, simply helped because it was right. "It was the only reasonable choice," Colin said. "For you, not for most beings." Dravener's expression was difficult to read. "You show me something I had forgotten. That genuine goodness exists. That not everything is transaction and leverage." Colin looked at Kira and Soren, happy and safe, and felt warmth in his chest. "I got just as much from this as you did. I've never had family before." "Not really. You have family now," Dravener said firmly. "My clan is your clan. My protection is your protection. And my children love their snow father very much." The children had started calling Colin that, mixing human and dragon clan terms. Colin had tried to protest that he wasn't really their father. Dravener had simply said that family was choice, not just blood, and Kira and Soren had chosen. Later, Colin stood on the fortress observation deck, looking at the stars. A simple researcher who'd pulled two kids from Snowstorm and somehow ended up adopted by the galaxy's most dangerous crime lord. His colleagues back at the university would never believe it. But standing there, watching Kira and Soren play, while Dravener discussed something with Vyra, Colin realized he didn't care what anyone else believed. He'd acted with simple human kindness, expecting nothing, and gained everything that mattered.